back of the rim. Got it! Oh, the slam! Oh, using Curry way downtown. Oh, what a shot from Curry!
For most of the late 2000s, Atlanta was good in a way that never really scared anybody. 50 wins here, a second round there, ISO Joe buckets, the highlight factory. Honestly, the only thing they truly did of note was randomly push the 08 Celtics to 7. Other than this, at their best, they simply weren't ever considered real contenders. So the core lasted for a while, continued to stay near the middle, then finally admitted the clock was up in summer 2012 after another first round out. Ownership brought in Danny Ferry to lead the rebuild, as Joe Johnson was now 30 with money that needed to be cleared, and there were no realistic or meaningful improvements to be made. On July 11, 2012, Johnson was traded to the Brooklyn Nets in exchange for Jordan Farmar, Anthony Morrow, Jordan Williams, John Petro, Deshaun Stevenson, and a 2013 first-round pick. Trading Joe was an identity change, as he'd led the Hawks franchise in scoring since the 2006 season. Yeah, different world, kids. Old NBA wasn't afraid to run it back 100 times and get absolutely nowhere. The Marvin Williams deal followed, which meant in week 1, Danny Ferry effortlessly cleared the two most concerning contracts going forward. This left the 2013 Hawks with Kyle Korver at the 3, who'd come over from Chicago, Jeff Teague at the 1, who'd get an opportunity to start after a couple years off the bench, with Devin Harris and Deshaun Stevenson sharing the 2. Ferry's version of Atlanta would value the boring stuff. Passing, quick decisions, less your turn, my turn, which only made the squad valuable in highlights. It resulted in a 44-38 record, which wasn't actually terrible considering they were technically restarting. The important note here is how they ended the season in a 6-game first-rounder with the Pacers, who ended up in the conference finals. In May 2013, they hired Mike Budenholzer to bring Ferry's vision to the court, especially considering his source. 17 years inside the Spurs org taught him how to program a team to be stereotypically boring to the masses, yet elite at the actual game. A total deviation from the previous seasons. Almost exactly opposite, really. The player acquisitions that summer told you everything. Paul Millsap on a 2-year bargain. Now you have a 4 who can screen, pass, short roll, shoot, guard up and down a position, and it made him the perfect cog for what they aimed to build. On top of these advantages, he replaced Josh Smith, who took his pilgrimage to Detroit, marking the official end of the highlight factory. Damari Carroll was brought in to defend on a string, hit corner threes, yet neither move made the headlines as people were accustomed to just ignoring ATL. Both moves made the team make more sense. This move would have changed things forever though. Atlanta had scouted Giannis heavily. They'd actually been prepared to pick him at 17, and a very obscure reference out there tells how even a sporting director in Spain who'd signed him expected this. Well, Milwaukee apparently had a time traveler, as they unexpectedly took him a couple picks earlier at 15. This forced the Hawks to pivot to Dennis Schroeder, another quick guard to stabilize that rotation with Jeff Teague. By the end of 2013's offseason, the silhouette of the next Hawks unit was visible even if the record wouldn't reflect it. The ball wouldn't stick. 5 players would matter on every possession. The best shooter would be a weapon off movement and not just spot-ups. The bigs would pass. Defense wouldn't be just one stopper. Rather, 5 guys on the string committed to covering for each other when needed. Not in 2014, however. The year, which was actually kind of a prequel, starts with the one thing this version of Atlanta could not afford: a season-ending injury to Al Horford. Double OT in Cleveland right after Christmas, he tears his pec and immediately lowered the ceiling for the year. The Hawks still leaned into Bud's principles. Millsap did his job as the mobile big spreading the floor, handoffs, and defense, which helped him qualify for his first of 4 All-Star teams at 28 years of age. As suspected, the skill set appeared perfect for a big next to Al, which was a huge reason for excitement a year out. Instead, Bud experimented with para-antage to pull 5s above the break and widen the floor the best they could. Teague, who'd been steadily improving each year, was now averaging 19 and 8, while Korver led the league in threes, shooting 47% on 6 attempts. The 38 and 44 record, a mirror opposite of 2013, was to be expected. Their playoff performance? Wow. Indiana's identity had been Roy Hibbert's vertical wall. Bud's counter was to never let him build it. Looking at the Pacers' 5, you could understand how starting Teague, Korver, Carroll, Millsap, and Antich might have caused some issues. Then with the bench, they stayed mobile as every combination they played could either excel from 3 or speed and mobility. With these chess moves, Atlanta stole Game 1 in Indy. Teague and Millsap had their ways, while Paul George's debut as a known star in the playoffs resulted in a 6 of 18 night. While he would go on to have a successful series, Atlanta forced him into much harder looks than usual, hence the Pacers' offense slowing down. The small ball may have genuinely broken Roy Hibbert, however, who dropped to 5 points and 3 rebounds on the series. He went from averaging around 30 minutes a game during regular season play to just 21 for the 7 games of the first round. Although they would fall short after leading 3-2, the execution had been what Bud wanted in a bottle. Touch the paint, find the advantage, cash it out before the help arrives. The real story had been how the Hawks just pushed a 1 seed to the brink without their best player by using the movement shooting and 5 live options. If you had Horford back and 1 or 2 more grown-up wings, well, as a tapped-in Hawks fan, you might have thought higher about them headed into 2015 than the rest of the league. Summer answered that specific call without chasing a marquee name. Thabo Sefolosha was brought in on a quiet deal. This only a few years removed from his presence totally changing OKC's fortune against the Spurs on the way to the finals. Kent Bazemore arrived as a developmental wing who would cut hard and serve as yet another connective piece to a budding system. As usual, none of it drew much attention online, especially with this being the summer of LeBron heading back to Cleveland. There were bigger fish to fry than ATL moving on the margins. When camp opened, Horford was back at the hub, Millsap could now be the connector 4 alongside him, Korver had already proven he could do his job at an elite level, while Carroll, Thabo, and Baze would provide the length and effort to technically make them a deep team. The important thing there was, those names just don't move anybody. This is why people remember 2015 as a surprise. What actually happened is 2014 proved the model under stress. Lose your best big for 3/4 of the season and still go on to shake a 1 seed and former conference finals runner-up to its core. Unlike the randomness the NBA world remembers, this was a process that actually kind of worked out. The regular season that people called a fluke in real time didn't read like one up close. They opened up at an expected and mundane 7-6 record, falling short to teams people cared way more about such as Cleveland, Toronto, and San Antonio. Nothing to see here, right? If there's one thing this franchise was uncomfortably used to, it was being in the middle of the pack. Then things just hit warp speed. Having improved to 21-8 by Christmas, they routed off a 19-game win streak that stretched across all of January, where they became the first team in NBA history to go 17-0 in a calendar month. Over this time, they took out Cleveland, the Clippers, Memphis, and Chicago. All teams they'd potentially have to see one day if they were who they appeared to be. Which was the Spurs of the East, by the way. As we've been building up to, it fit because the basketball fit. Hot potato passing, advantages mostly created by movement. It was all very similar to the organization Bud spawned from, almost as if this had been the plan. Here's the problem. We actually still had the Spurs at the time, who were 30-18 by the end of the Hawks' win streak. With ATL sitting at 40-8, there still weren't many people who'd have told you they were better than or going to beat the defending champion Spurs. San Antonio swept the season series via a narrow early win in November and an absolute rout in March. The two simply were not the same, which is a big reason the events of the next months came as almost no surprise. The machine that spat out Coach Bud didn't just have his principles, it had Hall of Fame shot creation baked in. Duncan could end the possession on the block or the elbow against any coverage. Parker could win a playoff game spamming high PNR. Ginobili could bend the defense solo when a set died. And so clearly could have had more accolades his entire career. Atlanta's best players like Horford and Millsap were connectors first. They punished help, but they didn't really force it. He gave them paint touches, but he was not Tony. Not even close. Korver bent the floor without the ball, yet that was it. It's the reason nobody was really shuddering over them having 4 All-Stars in real time. Or even when they all won Eastern Conference Player of the Month. It was like, cool, they're great, but we've seen this exact formula done better by better. As a matter of fact, once again, despite the records, this was happening in real time out west. All this being said, in hindsight, the starting 5 Player of the Month thing was absolutely hilarious. The league needed something in the East so bad with all the prior injuries. But yes, Teague, Millsap, Horford, and Korver as an all-star replacement put this team in rare air, as they tied a record for most all-stars from one unit. When you put them next to the other 8 teams on that list, yeah, you can see where this is going. Nonetheless, they assisted at elite rates, and sat near the top on both ends on the efficiency tables while playing clean, turnover-light offense. When another team exactly like that came into town from Golden State in February, the Hawks handled that test as well, securing a 124-116 victory behind 23 points from Teague, as 6 other Hawks hit double figures. They also forced Curry into an uncharacteristically bad shooting night during his official breakout year. The Warriors got their look back in March, though with both squads missing key pieces. Against the Cavs, they had nights that fed belief. On March 6 in Atlanta, they closed out a 106-97 win, with Schroeder and Mike Scott combining for 29 points off the bench. The match brought the team's season series to 3-1. Just another of many instances where LeBron-led teams would appear to have an issue on the horizon. But no, it wasn't an issue, and anybody who'd done this routine with Miami already knew as much. Yet, the final standings showed Atlanta at 60-22, Cleveland 53-29. The Hawks and Warriors marked the only two 60-win records in the league. Funny enough, this made the standings so that Chicago and Cleveland would have to face in round 2, which was the conference showdown fans were far more interested in. Still, ATL weren't showing the typical flaws of a pretender. They'd beaten contending teams. Kyle Korver again led the league in three-point percentage, bending defenses off of motion at nearly 50%. Millsap and Horford worked as they'd imagine being mobile bigs, while the rest of the roster played their roles to a T. Regardless, the old NBA question hovered. Who was the bailout star when possessions died in the last 6 minutes against LeBron or another team with more firepower? Sports Illustrated playoff power rankings called them, quote, the trickiest team in the postseason to peg. They weren't wrong. Right before the playoffs, Atlanta lost the wing that made their defense feel whole. In the early hours of April 8th, 2015 in Manhattan, the same area where Pacers forward Chris Copeland had been stabbed in a separate incident, Thabo Sefolosha and Para Ancic were arrested during a police response. In the course of the arrest, Sefolosha suffered a fractured right fibula and ligament damage, underwent surgery, and the team ruled him out for the rest of the regular season and the entire playoffs. Sefolosha publicly said the injury occurred during the arrest and blamed the NYPD. Months later, a jury acquitted him of the charges, and the city ultimately settled his civil suit for about $4 million. Those outcomes didn't change what Atlanta had already lost: their best perimeter stopper and a low-usage connector who fit Bud's defense on a string. In games, his absence showed up in all the subtle places that became loud in May. With Thabo, the Hawks could throw length and IQ at the opponent's top wing, keep Kyle Korver out of the heaviest assignments, and still maintain structure behind the ball. Without him, they had fewer clean answers for elite downhill wings and had to stretch Carroll and Bazemore across tougher usage. They went a pedestrian 17-13 in games he missed during the year, which is an underrated fact missing from later narratives about this unit. Inside the locker room, players later called it heartbreaking, not just emotionally, but because it undercut the exact defensive identity that got them to a top record in the league for the first time since 1994. Matter of fact, this would mark one of only 3 times in history the franchise would finish top 5 in the league. If you were a Spurs of the East advocate, this was the kind of loss San Antonio could often cover. The Hawks did not have a second Sefolosha. The injury removed their most playoff-shaped wing from the rotation right when the matchups mattered most. Still, this was the Eastern Conference, which had been reeling from years of injury to its top contenders. With no PG in the picture, the only team it felt they couldn't definitively beat were the Cavs, and the regular season didn't back that up. Of course, the regular season featured Thabo, and it's the regular season. They opened as the 1 seed, and for a week, looked like it. They held serve to go up 2-0 on the Nets as expected, then the series got weird in Brooklyn. Game 3 flipped on an 18-0 Nets run that bled across quarters, causing the Hawks to drop their first match of the postseason quite early. Game 4 turned into one of Deron Williams' last great games with 35 points, which helped Brooklyn seize victory in overtime. Suddenly, a 60-win 1 seed was tied 2-2 while people dusted off the pretender label. Really, it didn't even have to be dusted off at this point. Clippers, Spurs, Warriors, Cavs, these were all teams who, over the span of a series, were comfortably clear of Atlanta in many fans' minds. Falling into a tussle with an 8th seed only confirmed it, though the other side of the bracket almost immediately gave reason for pause. Kevin Love suffered a dislocated shoulder in Game 4 of the sweep in Boston, immediately striking him from the postseason. This is likely one reason you've hardly ever seen Sefolosha's absence mentioned. The Hawks were able to close it out in 6, bringing a unit whose moment was supposedly coming any time now. Round 2 against Washington started with another jolt. The Wizards stole Game 1 on the road, with their perimeter stars carrying the bulk of the load. Unfortunately, John Wall's wrist took the bulk of the impact when he crashed to the floor on a fast break. The fracture would see to it that he played only 3 of the 6 games. Once again, disappointing. With the series tied 1-1 and no John Wall, Paul Pierce would create his most famous non-Celtic highlight, calling game and adding fuel to the fire of the pretender narrative. The precursor to Atlanta's fate, which now lay less than a month away, was how Washington used half-court problem-solving to stay in it even without Wall. Bradley Beal took charge, living in the high pick-and-roll and empty corner stuff, hunting Teague and Korver, which had been the exact type of issue Thabo helped alleviate. Paul Pierce slid to the 4 in certain lineups, which pulled Millsap or Horford out to the arc and opened gaps for Beal and Otto Porter. Defensively, they all but proved a capable team would be able to figure Atlanta out. They top-locked and trailed Korver off pin downs, switching or pre-switching when needed, so he rarely got clean looks. This drug him down to 7 points and 28% from 3. This was exactly why the raw number of all-stars the Hawks had didn't hold a lot of weight. His lack of production was nearly the equivalent of straight up missing 2 of their regular season wing producers, so then keeping Teague out of the paint wasn't as difficult either. Paul Millsap came down with a sickness which saw him actually have to come off the bench for a game and took him down to 39% from the field and just 21% from 3. Yeah, the picture should be pretty clear. Wall or no wall, Bradley Beal was the best shot creator on the floor. A good bit better than anything the Hawks could counter with. Once again, back to the Spurs narrative. San Antonio did things by committee, but there were never questions as to who could create when things slowed down. See the first 3 games of the 2014 finals. Via this exact concern, Washington literally rubbed shoulders with the Game 7, only falling short because Pierce's Hail Mary was late. By a hair. The 60-win Hawks advanced to their first conference finals in franchise history. It probably didn't arrive with the expected excitement. The previous 2 rounds had done enough, but this was LeBron James sitting on the opposite side now. Not Deron Williams with 1 foot out of the league. No 50-year-old Paul Pierce with one-handed John Wall this time. Bron had been to the finals for 4 straight years by now, and had already seen this team structure done better by better. All things considered, almost any reference you could look at had Cleveland as the favorites. Cleveland, without Kevin Love, and a Kyrie Irving you weren't sure was going to make it through a game. Nobody was foolish enough by May to go choosing against the King of the East. The other side to it was, the Cavs had already survived the test fans had been waiting on. Everything in life is optics, and despite anything the Hawks did before April, Chicago had been more trusted for the same reasons Bradley Beal had nearly uprooted the series. D. Rose, Gasol, Butler. Not only was there a lot of creation there, they were more recognizable, and D. Rose's siege against LeBron already had legs from years earlier. The Bulls felt a lot more like the team who was supposed to have been there for the last few seasons, as opposed to a surprise unit that was easy to knock. Well, Cleveland already had them figured out too. These were the reasons the incoming sweep of the conference finals was only a little surprising. LeBron at the controls surrounded by shooters would prove to be a nearly unstoppable formula at multiple points in his career, including a few years later when he took almost nothing but role players to the finals again. Yeah, whatever, it's the East, but these were still incredible feats. Game 1 in Atlanta set the blueprint. He lived in pick and rolls to force switches, then played bully ball from the middle of the floor. When the Hawks sent help, the Cavs shooters responded by having 3 players hit better than 37% from 3. Kyrie was well on his way to being the 4th, only knee tendonitis limited him to only 2 outings. J.R. Smith detonated for 8 threes as the Cavs stole home court, and I'd personally already seen enough. If injuries were going to ruin their run, it would have already happened against Chicago. LeBron easily ripped off a 31-point, 7-rebound, 6-assist masterclass to send a clear message. There simply wasn't going to be an Eastern team to arise out of the blue and take his chain. On the other end, the book was already out on how to dismantle the Hawks' rhythm in a playoff series. This only got easier as Korver sprained his ankle 2 games through, costing him the rest of the postseason, while Carroll tried to tough through a sprained knee. 2 games in, a team built on depth had essentially dwindled down to Teague, Millsap, and Horford. Game over. LeBron went back to the finals, and Atlanta went back to earth. The 2015 Hawks instantly became the poster child for pretenders, and a cautionary tale about basketball played before April. Why is this likely your first time realizing just how banged up they were? Well, for one, they weren't really that banged up relative to how bad they struggled through the first 2 rounds. Then, obviously, both Washington and Cleveland sustained more notable losses without ever looking outclassed. Again, everything in life is optics, and no amount of Thabo Sefolosha or Kyle Korver could compete with seeing LeBron nearly average a triple-double without either of his healthy co-stars by his side on the way to a sweep. But wait, as you've seen, this specific Hawks core had already been showing the signs before their breakout year. It's just nobody paid attention. So then what happened to them? DeMar Carroll left for Toronto in July, which did even more to expose Korver. That wing spot wasn't just a name, it was the glue that let him breathe on offense and let Bud's defense switch and shrink without overhelp. This feature weakened, while Kyle dropped to 39% from 3 and 9 points a game. Thiago Splitter arrived to add more Spurs principles and second unit size, only to be lost by spring via a hip injury. The defense actually improved to 2nd best in the league with Sefolosha's return, and Millsap putting together one of the best 2-way seasons of his career. It just didn't matter because the offense dropped from 6th to 22nd. For reference, the lowest rated offense to ever win a title was Detroit at 18th in 04. Obviously, they were far more dominant defensively. The 2016 Hawks finished 48-34, beat Boston in 6 on the back of that defense, as the Celtics really didn't have the talent to compete, and then of course ran into the same wall. It wasn't even worth a second thought this time. The core started fading right after. At the 2016 trade deadline, Horford and Teague rumors were already being floated. Then Al left for Boston in free agency. A few weeks later, Jeff Teague was moved in a 3-team deal that netted a lottery pick. By January 2017, Korver was in a Cavaliers jersey, and by that summer, Millsap had signed in Denver. If there was ever a shot at this by-committee unit going all the way, 2015 was the only realistic shot. Years later, Teague kept it simple on podcasts. In his eyes, they were a great team that, like so many others, ran into LeBron. He isn't really wrong. Even with the injuries, they might have been able to beat any other squad in the East bracket. Without them, maybe they could have gotten close to a hobbled Cleveland, but given the strategy, that's still a really hard sell. 2015 proved a beautiful idea could raise your floor to 60 wins and still leave your ceiling in someone else's hands. Honestly though, since 2004, this concept as a championship winning formula has pretty much been debunked. You really can't depend on the Spurs style if you aren't close to Spurs talent. And as for the 2004 Pistons, having actually watched the 2004 series myself, I can say they were good, but certainly benefited from multiple injuries to LA, which are virtually never mentioned in the super team collapse story. They are the only somewhat recent team to win without a consensus superstar, or superstar creator. Every champion since, and a lot of them before, always have one or two guys you could trust to bail you out. Great basketball principles though. If you're a real sicko, the Hawks footage is worth a watch sometime. It's just a shame they weren't playing in 2004.